Yeah, so it turns out the problem is I have a really shitty phone. Um, so that's what I get for buying refurbished materials. And so I'm going to try to make the best of this as I possibly can. Uh,
Yeah, no,
I
you're
do have
good.
a new, I have a microphone, so I got this to help out. Let me try to set this up so it's not, so I'm not holding it the whole time. And I am ready whenever you are once that's all set up.
Yeah, I think we're good.
How you doing,
Let's give
man?
it like another minute or so for see who else is going to join.
Yeah, sure, that sounds great. Um,
Yeah, but this is better. I know last time you had to mute it, then unmute it, mute it, unmute it.
oh, oh my God, yeah. So I had so many problems. Oh, I remember what happened. Good. Okay, so many problems. So it was the phone, but then like halfway through our interview, and it was like a whole thing. And I was just like, my phone died, and and then I couldn't get trying to quickly log on to TikTok through my computer. But then, like,
Yeah,
in order to get on TikTok through you have to have like 3 apps or something to download first. And then you have to do all this like verification and blood samples, and it was awful.
yeah, I know
So
the full
yeah,
stream to get
it
on
was
there.
just oh
Yeah,
my
so
God, yeah.
I mean that's why we wanted to do this today
Um,
because usually I upload it, and that one we didn't get a chance to
yeah.
finish. The audio was a little off, so
Oh, and I was not on my best game. That's for sure. I was not like my best. I was like, I was looking back. I was like, I remember. I think I remember mentioning my book maybe in the first 10 minutes of the interview, and then after that, it went off the rails. And I was like, that's not how I wanted to be. So I'm
yeah.
glad you
So
gave me the
what I'll
second
do,
chance, man. That was
yeah, no worries, man. What I'll do is I'm gonna download this app probably
mm-hmm.
tomorrow, and then I'll load it on the
Okay.
YouTube channel for my podcast, and then I'll send you the link. So then we can get
Awesome.
whoever's not
Awesome.
on watching or whoever doesn't watch the whole thing, they can go back and see it.
Absolutely. Great. That's awesome. Much better. And I actually have things that I'm like points I actually want to make this time around. So I'm
Perfect.
gonna go ahead and share this with other people if that's okay.
Yeah, no,
I
definitely,
told a lot of
definitely.
people that we were going to do this tonight, and I tried to share it earlier with some people, but they kept saying that like every time I sent the link, it came back as unavailable. So I don't know if that means I'm in like TikTok jail or something.
No, maybe just
I don't
because
know.
maybe because it wasn't active yet. I don't know. I haven't done it enough to know either. So
Okay. So yeah, I will go ahead and share this with all my friends. Hopefully that would be cool. If Reader to Writer Press shows up, he's actually my copy editor, and
okay,
he's also an author himself. His name is Brian Hershey, and I cannot give enough credit to like the great amount of work he did on my book. I like to say that I mean I obviously wrote the story, but he gave the beast its legs,
yeah,
you know. So
yeah.
yeah, there you go.
You
I just
catch him
shared
or
it with
you
him.
see him, let me know so we can
Yeah, I shared it with
get
him.
him out.
Yeah, I shared it with him. Yeah, and I'll share your profile with him too.
Okay,
I don't know if he gets on TikTok very much. So
okay, sounds good. Um, if you want, we can get started, or you want to give another minute for a couple people, or
I mean, I'm ready to go whenever you are, sir. This is your show. I'm just the monkey.
so we can get going then. So for everybody watching, I want to introduce you to author Zachariah Chamberlain. You may already know him. You may be following him. Not definitely give him a follow. Why don't you introduce yourself to the viewers that are watching and to those that are going to watch the downloaded version later?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Zachariah Chamberlain, and I'm the author of We Come Bearing Curses. By the way, you can call me Zach, because I have gone on lives enough to know that like saying Zachariah 100 times in a conversation is extremely difficult. So I like to tell people that Zachariah is just my stage name. And that's it. So, we're all friends here. You can call me Zach. And I wrote this wonderful book called We Come Bearing Curses. I'm currently working on the sequel, and that's going to be tentatively, that's titled We Break Curses. And it is so because of you, the talk community, people like you, Adrian, that the book has been doing so well. And would you like me to tell you what the book is about? Kind of a real quick recap.
Yeah, definitely give
I
a summary.
I don't know what direction you want to go.
Much or little as you want to share.
Yeah, sure. No, fantastic. So the book is a Lovecraftian cult horror. And anybody who's familiar with Lovecraft, his elements, I think that his elements themselves are timeless. Madness, things from the deep, dark cosmos. Excuse me for a second. So sorry. Something, monsters from the deepest, darkest depths of the cosmos. Evil gods that, either don't care about us or just want to do us a great deal of harm. But then there's also twisted cults that want to summon these creatures because they've been promised this idea of, immortality or power. So that's the elements, but it all takes place here in the Midwest. And the story centers around two brothers, Thaddeus and George, who have been separated for years by shared family trauma. And their time apart, they both have experienced unusual phenomena that they displayed some gifts. And only one of them has fully embraced these abilities, these gifts, and has actually become kind of like enveloped in this world of magic, while the brothers just try to be a normal, he's like, I'm just a cop. That's how he is. So for both of them separated, both of them have a touch of magic in them, and then both of them happen to go back to their hometown where they've experienced so much pain and suffering and loss because they've been essentially been given a vision that if they don't come back home, the world will end. And it's all due to this psychotic family of cultists. So for people who've read the book, and if you get a chance and you're following my page, you can go back and read some of the reaction reviews. It is a whole experience. I write very cinematically, and I also have a history of being a first responder. So, I get to tie in some of the sensory experiences that I had into my storytelling. So, for instance, when I say, hey, the smell of bile or blood or whatever, I'm talking about from personal experience. I know what this smells like. This is awful, things like that. But also, I write from a very personal level. The heart of this story is about trauma recovery. The whole series is about trauma recovery, and this first book in the series is about identifying trauma. And family trauma, it cuts deep, and it takes a lot to get over. So the whole series will be about the process of recovering from that. And I get to share my own personal experiences, my own trauma and my own experiences through these characters, which I think is what makes them relatable and really kind of like draws that reader in.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that on the last time we talked about it, and talked about how sometimes bringing those experiences, bringing some of that into your book, is sometimes therapeutic, is sometimes healing, sometimes not when you're going through it and rehashing or re-talking about it.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, but it really goes back to that connection to the reader and that connection that they feel. And when when you are in your truth, when you're in that and actually, bringing that out, they feel that. They feel that connection from you, from your words and from what you put on paper.
Yeah, and as I'm writing these books, I'm also learning a lot from these characters and their experiences, but also from my own readers. I've had readers, talk to me about, their trauma and how, they were kind of trepidatious of me reading the story because of the fact that there are certain topics. So for those of you who are looking for the trigger warnings but you're interested in reading the books, I will say that this story talks about child abuse. It does talk about domestic violence. It does talk about drug addiction. Um, it talks about you know unaliving oneself and others. Um, it is not, and I will say that it does touch on several sensitive topics, but I do my very best to honor the readers and try to talk about a lot of that stuff like off scene. I don't spend a lot of time going into gritty details about that stuff. Mostly because I trust the reader can pretty much formulate their own scenes in their own head, you know, their own scenes in their own head. I swear I do put words together on paper.
But
Anyway,
it's true. I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit last time too. Is, especially in horror, and especially in some of the older
mhm,
horror or some of the low budget horror, a lot of the stuff is left to the imagination, right? They didn't have the money or
yeah,
they didn't have the ability to really show a lot of the stuff. And sometimes that's even the better way to do it, because the reader or the viewer is always going to make it that much more scary, that much more horrific, that much more traumatic in their own mind, what they can come up with, and sometimes what you can even explain, because they use what their fears are, they use what their traumas are, and when you just hint at it or kind of mention it, they can take over and kind of take themselves on their own journey. And it's interesting that horror is the one genre that you can do a lot more of that with.
sorry. Yeah. So I find that for me, horror was therapy. Um, Mostly because one, I was introduced to it way too early. I mean, I was 6 years old when I first saw American Werewolf in London, and I was terrified, but I was also like, ooh, Wolfman. I was like 8 when I watched Amityville Horror and Rosemary's Baby. I was way, way too young, but I was also put in this like very safe place because I got to watch it with my mother, on Friday nights, eating popcorn. She had canned sardines. I don't, still to that memory, I'm like, why? Canned sardines and crackers. Why? Um, um, but yeah, I mean, I got to watch these things with her. I got to stay up late and I got to break the rules. It was all very like kind of fun and exciting. And um, yeah, like I said, it became comfort food for me and for my brain. And then later on, as I'm, and then growing up, that was like my thing. I was scared of everything in real life growing up. I mean, as a child, I had so much going on. I had a lot of, I had kind of a crappy childhood, you know. But that being said, it was like weird because like even through all that fear and all that, stuff that I was kind of going through as a child, horror films were still kind of this escape for me.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the reason of all this is because it was like there was a horror story in me, and it had to mature and grow, and I had to do some, and I still have lots of. I'm a 47-year-old man who says I got a lot of growing up to do, and that's true. It is true.
It is the truth, no matter the age, though, right? I mean, growth doesn't stop at a number.
Right, and and that's the thing, and I'm like I said, I'm still learning from my readers and followers and stuff that like there are people who are at various levels of recovery, and you can't push a book onto somebody um, until they're ready, right? Which I find fascinating because like a lot of the dark romance novel writers and readers, they're like, oh, look at oh, I love all the trigger warnings and all that stuff. And I was like, I could let me take a swing at this. And what I found was, yeah, I'm not. There's certain things I will blush at. There are certain things there are certain lines that I was like, yep, I can't do it. I've read some wonderfully written stories, but because of the way it's told and the way my brain was able to, process that story, I was like, yeah, I just can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And there are certain movies that I have a really hard time with, horror films that I think are absolutely wonderful. I can only watch them about once, and then after that, I just can't do it again. And the new version of Pet Sematary gets a bad rap, but I will say that it really did a good job of touching on like despair and grief and things like that. I mean, of course, the book is always going to be better, but I thought that the new movie actually wasn't that bad. I don't know why it got trashed so bad, but that's just me.
Yeah, it's interesting because of the trigger warnings and stuff. You have to remember as a writer, even as other readers, that you have to honor and respect what that trigger warning is because it is like you said, it's different for everybody,
Yeah.
and it could be something that somebody feels is not that deep, but for somebody else it could be because you don't know what their experience is or whether what their traumas were, and you have to respect that. You have to understand that it is different, and that could be very impactful for somebody else.
Yeah, and that's something I'm still learning.
Yeah.
I used to talk a big game about being trauma informed and very knowledgeable about the person experiencing these things, and through a series of just mistakes, I'm still learning that hey, I need to be a little more self-aware, and I need to be paying attention, and there's things that, and like, again, everybody's at a different place, and so even then, as I was writing this book, I'm like, oh well, how am I going to tell the reader, because I did kind of struggle with that. I juggled that idea of like, should I put trigger warnings at the beginning of the book, and finally I just said yes, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And one of the bigger reasons is I didn't want somebody to go in, blind and like kind of get hit by this, scene or something like that, and then like hate the story because of that.
Yeah.
If you don't like the story, just don't read it.
Yeah, it's better. It's better to.
I tried to also word the trigger warnings. Yeah, and I also tried to word that trigger warning in a way that was like, they didn't give the story away as well. Like I didn't want. I mean, and that's the one thing I talked about with, and then another interview. Somebody was like, "Well, I think that trigger warnings, if you give them about a horror story, it kind of gives away the story." I'm like, "Well, no, you can tactfully talk about what is triggering about a horror story." without giving it away.
Yeah.
And I hope
And
I succeeded in that.
yeah, and besides, really, especially for a horror story, I mean, you may know certain things are gonna come up, but it's again how the experience comes up, right? What the scene's about,
Yes.
how you enter into the scene. So you're kind of maybe kind of giving something away, but not fully, right? It's not. You're still gonna be immersed in that story and as it happens, what's going on.
And I hope so. I mean, that's my intent, is to tell a good enough story that it really like. I used to talk about, it's like I want to dunk my reader's head in ice cold bath and have them come out of it in a horror, in like one of those extreme horror houses, haunted houses or something. I want them to be completely enveloped, and I hope that that was I think I did an okay job. Um, and I think it was like the whole reason this book got written was because I kind of issued a challenge to myself, because I was always bitching about how like Hollywood is not doing a very good job about putting a 10 out of 10 horror film for me.
Yep.
I mean, it's like, man, the stuff coming out of Hollywood really doesn't scare me. And I wonder, I begin to wonder, I'm like, maybe I'm dead inside. Maybe I'm a psychopath. Maybe I don't have feelings anymore, which is absolutely not true. I mean, I clearly have feelings. Um, so I said, I was like, you know what? Instead of whining about, not having a 10 out of 10, make one,
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of the stuff that's in the story is personal for me, because these are the things that either I have experienced, or, you know, like for instance, there's a scene in the story that's based off a night terror, a reoccurring night terror that I experienced for about 10 years. And even when I talked about that with my therapist, yes, I was like, yeah, so that was terrifying. She's like, well, that's probably 10 out of 10 for you. I was like, yeah, pretty close. I mean, it was pretty horrible. Um, but yeah, and I've always been fascinated by like the cults that are out there, because I think I got a lot of the movies I got early exposure with were the 60s and 70s, like horror films, and they were all about like you know the devil worshippers, and because that was like everybody was scared of all that stuff.
That was the main theme back then. That's what most
Yeah,
people
it
know.
was. It's ironic that we go from the main theme is devil worshippers and cultists, to then come the 80s where it's like the main theme of fears are sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and then 90s it was all like AIDS. I
Yeah.
mean, and by the way, I hope I'm allowed to say any of this. TikTok, I apologize.
No, I think you're
Please
fine.
don't.
I think you're fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the rules. I still find myself like, is this a rule? Is this still a rule? Okay. Um, I haven't been banned yet, so there's that. Um, so hey, TikTok, be nice. Um, yeah, so I grew up on that, and also I was raised Catholic, and I was like, it was like a weird Catholic upbringing where like my grandparents were of the who went to the Catholic Church that still spoke Latin. That's how they held their certain sermons. Um, which as a kid, I was like, I don't know what's going on anyway. But then my mom was like very much into like, prophecies and people who could see the future. And, she had all these like kind of like fun ideas. And that kind of just like, and then of course she was like, very, like, oh, watch out for those, Satanists. They're still out there, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, really? I don't know. Okay, and I was like 8 years old. That's fine. You know, I have the boogeyman to worry about. You give me this too? Okay, that's awesome.
But I
Um,
mean, really, it goes. It's interesting because you made a good point. You hadn't seen a 10 out of 10, So why not write it? And that's the beauty of being an indie author, is that you write the stories you want to see, right? You write the stories you've been looking for. You've been kind of craving. Like, I've always wondered why nobody's written this or why nobody wrote it in this way. And you can do that. You can take it any way you want to go.
Well, and I don't see enough of the Lovecraftian elements,
Yeah.
especially in horror films. And I kind of understand it. I was starting to write this stuff. I was kind of like, oh, well, how do we conceptualize something that's like, for instance, like Cthulhu?
Mm-hmm.
In Lovecraft's stories, he would talk about how a monster like Cthulhu, this evil, dark, god, was so massive and so monstrous that just viewing him would drive a person insane. And so it kind of like, I was like, well, how do we put that into words, though? From the person viewing the monster, as opposed to like Cthulhu rose out of the water and everybody who saw them went crazy. Tell them why they went crazy. Excuse me. It's like, okay, let's write that from their perspective then. Like, why were they going insane? Like, I mean, because if I was to see a giant octopoid monster come out of the ocean and summon tempests and storms, I don't know if I would react the same way that somebody in the 1930s would react. I'd be like, that is something. Let's call in the fighter jets. I've seen how monster movies work. I've seen how this goes down. Which is like, when you go and you like look at cosmic horror like art, the stuff that is kind of like unsettling is when they create, when somebody creates a piece of art where it makes you feel small. Like, so my daughter gave me a cold. I think I had a cold last time we talked too, by the way, which is always awesome.
I remember.
Yeah, I think so. It was just one of the many problems that we had during my interview. It was like, Zach wouldn't stop coughing. You sounded like crap. Anyway, there's these like, you see these like artists. They'll put like some like they'll draw like a little person on a mountain, and then he's facing the sky, and looking down from the sky is this gigantic eyeball, which is some being out in the atmosphere, out in the cosmos, just looking down on him, making him feel very tiny. And to me, I'm like, yeah, that would be horrifying. That would drive me, that would make me crap my pants, I think. I could feel the fear from that, Anyway, that's my rant about, so I think that's the thing. I wanted to write something that was like, okay, how could we write something that would, like, if you see this in real life, this actually might drive you a little crazy. This would leave some emotional and mental scars in real life, So I did my very best. And I think the epilogue to my story hopefully did that. Because I was like, I might have like knocked it out of the park too quick, too early. I really liked the epilogue, and I feel like it set the tone for the rest of the book. Which I think if you're going to write an epilogue, I think I remember somebody was telling me they read Stephen King's book on writing. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he talked about is like, and I could be completely wrong. So if anybody's read the book, please correct me. I have yet to read it. It's on my TBR. But there was something said about like hitting it out of the park, set the tone right out of the bat. And for instance, in it, by the way, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, plug your ears, kiddos. In the very beginning, like 15 minutes of it, when Georgie gets unalived gruesomely, that stuck with me forever. And that was, and like the same way with Jaws and Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's like, they come and they open up the movie and they're like, hey, by the way, blah, and they like, you get hit with something just horrifying. And, yeah, and like Jaws, the same thing. And then I made the mistake of reading the book that somebody wrote a book based off the movie Jaws, and they went into very gritty, gnarly details about what the shark did to that poor girl at the very beginning of the movie. And I was like, well, I'm never gonna go in the water again. There we go. I didn't learn how to swim anyway. That's fine. Damn sharks.
It is a good point too, but hitting it quickly, right? Hitting that story quickly. That was something I did in my zombie book that's coming out like in August.
Yeah.
But it starts basically, I think, maybe the third paragraph. You're in it, right? It's not a big build up. It's hitting there, and you're going from that point to the rest of the book. Because I've always, like you said, I like that where you know kind of what if you're reading a zombie book, you know what the book is going to be about roughly. So you don't need that long setup. I was like, I'm just going to hit it at the start, and you're in it, right? You're in it from that beginning all the way through. And it was even something I did kind of with the trigger warnings too for the zombie is I don't like seeing a lot of things where children are hurt or wounded or something in movies. I don't like it, right? A lot of times I'll even turn it. I'll say, nah, I'm not going to do it. But in the zombie book, I have children and infants and stuff getting attacked, and because realistically it's going to happen and you never see it. But I was like, to be true to a zombie apocalypse, it's going to happen. They're not going to be kept out of it. They're not going to be part of the horrific stuff that's happening. And some people on the beta readers like, I can't do it. I was like, I completely understand. I'm with you. It was not even easy to write it, but you have to be true sometimes to that, and just it's going to happen, right? It's going to be in there. But it was interesting on the trigger side of that.
Yeah, there are some scenes that I write in the books. I'm like, man, this sucks. I have to write this, but this hurts. And you have to bleed a little into the paper. Yeah. I just like saying things like that because it's like really messed up. But you have to you have to wound yourself. You have to bleed a little. You have to you have to sacrifice yourself.
That should be your catchphrase as a horror author. Yeah, you have to bleed a little.
You have to bleed a little. I think Clive Barker actually caught that one first when he wrote Books of Blood. Yeah. So I can't take it. And I respect that man way too much to even mess with the guy. But I think it's Books of Blood opens up with a quote or something he wrote. It says, "Every human being is a book of blood. Wherever we are open, we are read." And I was like, "Ooh, that's catchy." Okay, Clive, I see what you did there. Yeah, there are some scenes in horror that are particularly hard, and even now, as I'm writing the sequel, I'm like, I have to write about this thing. And so, for instance, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but like I said, I do talk about alcoholism and addiction. And the primary reason for that is because I'm now 90 days sober. I've quit drinking, which is interesting because I had to pretty much relearn how to write as a sober person. But that also meant I had to give a voice to some of that stuff. And I was like, man, I did not hit it. I was like, I never wanted to drink. I never wanted to do anything. But then I wrote this one scene about addiction and the kind of conversation that people have with themselves. And thank you, Nikki. I'm trying. It was hard to write that scene. That one scene. It was the first time where I was like, yep, this sucks. Because I gave it a voice, almost. But I will say that now, looking back on it, I'm glad I got to write it, because I kind of pour some of that energy that I do that makes going back to that lifestyle kind of more loathsome, So yeah, it is kind of also helping me stay sober, which, I mean, I'm not bragging. Actually, it's not been that tough a journey so far. But I don't think I've, and I'm not okay, because the universe listens. Let's not tempt it with by throwing me a curveball in my life. 9 months. Congrats, Nikki. Seriously, I am envious. And you got this too. I know that there are certain milestones in sobriety. I'm just going to talk to the readers here real quick, the people who showed up. I know that there are certain milestones in sobriety that for some odd reason they will test you. And I heard 9 months was tough. I don't know why. I think it's because you're coming close to that 1 year mark. And at that point, you're like a veteran. They said, yep, you got this. You got it. You just got to stick with it now. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking out of my ass. But I mean, I've heard that in the meetings and stuff like that. Yeah.
Congratulations to both of you. I didn't want to
Yeah, seriously.
when you were talking, but to both of you, I mean, proud of both of you.
Yeah. It's been an experience, I will say. So congrats, Nikki. So there's a lot of stuff that I give voice to in my stories because I think it needs to be heard. Mental illness is a big one as well. Depression, anxiety, stuff like that. And I've been in recovery for complex post-traumatic stress for nearly a decade now, and I really wanted to write the feelings, the actual physical experience that somebody goes through when they have a PTSD episode. Something triggered it, and now they're just caught up in the emotions of it. And anybody who has PTSD will tell you about it. You're just back in that moment. And so I try to honor those who are in recovery for such a thing. Talk about it and kind of, write what that feels like for people who don't know. And if you want to experience such a thing in a safe manner, in a mildly controlled environment, I would suggest trying to eat a Carolina Reaper. I don't know if anybody's ever ate a hot pepper like that. That is the closest I can tell you that I've come to, having an episode. Sorry, it's awful.
No worries.
Yeah.
I mean,
I went through. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's great that you put a voice to a lot of these because unfortunately, mental health, PTSD and stuff like that. A lot of times, there's not a voice technically given. You hear things, you hear people talk about mental health and stuff, but sometimes that voice is not given, and it's always those things unsaid that could be said that mean so much more. And when you're going through that, you're honoring that by going through and explaining some of that. It does help the ones that have experienced it or are going through it understand that. And it's interesting because you know writing can be almost like a journal entry. It can be therapeutic like a journal entry. And one of the things is when you write some of these experiences for a character, it's much easier for you to let those words come out because you're technically, even though it is you, you're not saying this is me saying this. You're like, this is the character going through that. So sometimes it is very therapeutic to do it through a character, say all the things you want to say or wanted to say, and technically you're like, it's not me saying it, it's the character saying it, but you're getting it out, right? You're getting it out there and voicing those emotions, those feelings, that stuff that's been held in.
Well, and I will say that it's the other thing is that when we see such experiences, displayed on like in film and other sources of media, it's usually a stereotype, obviously, or it's comical, or it's, you know, like somebody who's like, you know, homeless or, you know, impoverished or something like that. I mean, we've seen it. Even people who have money and wealth and all this other stuff also have mental illness. And so we do need to, like, you know, try to, you know, respect and appreciate that it doesn't matter. I mean, mental illness doesn't care how much money, what caste you were born into, you know, none of that stuff. You can be impacted by it, and some of it's genetics, and some of it are the experiences that we go through. And even, like I said, even for somebody who's been going through this and kind of trying to be in recovery and stuff like that, I still make mistakes, you know, and it comes to also trying to be empathetic to other people's experiences. And it's like, this has been a huge, huge learning experience, and humbling. But if anything, if anybody's out there and they're dealing with stuff, whatever it is, even if it's mild, I say, you know, get a therapist now. Okay. Because I will tell you that, unfortunately, in our nation, you know, despite all the funding that a lot of counties out there have received, there's just not enough resources. And so I always say, you know, like, get a therapist as you would like a personal primary care physician. You know, somebody who's like, you know, who cups the gonads and makes you turn your head and cough, or bend over and grab your ankles. You know, get one of those people who just do nothing but mess with your head. You know, therapy is health. You know, and it's good to have somebody to talk to. I unfortunately did not have that when I hit rock bottom, and nothing's worse than hearing that we will have somebody see you in like 3 to 4 weeks. And this was pre-COVID, by the way. Yeah. And that was terrifying. You know, even now, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but even now, like if I ask for a prescription from my psychiatrist or something, and if I'm like in a bad place, and I don't see that prescription actually get to my pharmacist, I start getting concerned. I'm like, wow, how long do I have to wait for this to happen? And, you know, do you realize what's going on my side of things and all this other stuff? I mean, yeah, it's kind of a scary situation, which I think, again, this is why we need to write about this stuff. You know, we need to write about this stuff. And again, Lovecraft is all about madness. I mean, it's one of the biggest elements, madness and despair. And I will say that my book isn't all madness and despair and, something like that, you know, where it's just like, oh, you know, it's so hard. It isn't like that completely. I will say, it helps the readers relate, but also, you know, and that's true. Thank you, Jennifer. It helps the readers relate, but I also throw enough action in there and enough fun and enough humor to make it digestible. You know, you have to sugarcoat it. Yeah, I mean, not sugarcoat it. That's not right. But a teaspoon of honey helps the medicine go down, right?
Yeah, you have to give some form of relief within it. You can't just go an entire thing and just like, you know, just heavy. The overall message can be that, but you got to give them something, just a breather, right? You got to give them that little breather for a second or a moment, a chapter, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's like really important, even in horror films. I mean, you still see that. You see that, like, it's not like constant screaming, you know, because first of all, physiologically, our brains don't work that way. If you wrote 2 hours of nothing of people screaming and experiencing horrible things, at some point, the brain says, okay, I'm done. And it will disengage. The reader will disengage. So yeah, it's important to have, and also it's important, it's fun to have the action sequences. It's fun to write those things. It's fun to talk about the humor. I got to inject humor based off of, like the humor I experienced as a firefighter. I got to write in scenes and jokes and, just like some, things that I went through as a firefighter that were funny, that was kind of like hazing, even though that's not supposed to happen in the fire service. But, we all went through something where, you got a little picked on. And it's honestly, when you're in the same building in close quarters for 24 hours, 10 days a month for like literally a third of your life, a third of your month, you're hanging out with these people. A certain amount, a level of ball busting is going to happen, And so I got to inject some of that kind of, humor, but I think in a healthy way, hopefully, into my story. So yeah, I try to, respect that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a good point too, because horror, again, I think is probably the genre that does the most of that, where they do have, some comedy in it or something to break the moment. Everybody's getting disemboweled around them, but someone's gonna crack a joke on it, and you're like, sometimes it's completely out of place, but again, it's that slight relief from everything that's happening, right? And it's the one genre that's rolled with it and just keeps going with it.
Like, okay, and again, some of these new like horror remakes that get just a terrible rap, like the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Jennifer Beal, I believe, is in it. So it gets a horrible rap. Everybody's like, "Oh, it's garbage." It's like, okay, yeah. Does it compare to the original? Absolutely not. I mean, nothing is that gritty, But, and I can't remember the guy who played the quote unquote sheriff. He's also a drill sergeant, just a weird, just fascinating guy, right? And like, so, I thought overall, the whole film, I was like, man, this is dark. This is gritty. This is heavy. But then this guy comes on scene, and you're like, oh, I feel better now. He's weird, but, I bet you anything he's going to say something very inappropriate. And that's going to make me feel so much better. The guy from Full Metal Jacket is just going to make the scene so much better, And honestly, I mean, he sold the movie for me. I mean, I'm not a fan of Michael Bay, but by the way, Michael Bay, if you still want to make a movie about my book, that would be fantastic. I'm sorry I said anything like that. Please don't blackball me. Don't Megan Fox me, please. All right. But I will. Yeah, I think it's. You need to have that break. You need to have those moments of humor, and even if it's dark, So yeah. So I did try to inject as much of my kind of my humor into the stories as possible, and I love the fact that the sequel that I'm writing currently, I get to like go back and revisit some of those stories that I didn't get to like flesh out in the first one. I got to touch more on the relationships that didn't get to grow, or involve the reader more into like how two people, two characters relate to each other, stuff like that, where it's just like, and the other thing is too, is I get to write it about Kansas City. So the whole sequel takes place in Kansas City. And if you're a Kansas City native, you're going to know a lot of these, places. I throw little crumbs out there for just the people who live here. Silas and Maddie's. If you know what Silas and Maddie's is, you're a Kansas Citian. You are from Kansas. I talk about the West Bottoms and the meatpacking district, and all these other places, and like only the people from Kansas City would get that, and I think that's a nice little treasure just for them. A little like, hey, this is my love for my city, right? Um, and it also helps to write what right? I can't write about Italy or France, because I've never been there. You know, hopefully one day. Um, but yeah, so but to further describe the book for people who haven't read it yet and you're still kind of on the fence, even after this long-winded discussion that we've had about it, um, if you like the TV series Supernatural and the chemistry between those two brothers and the situations they were in, this is a lot like that, except on a much more extreme horror version of it. And then sprinkle in, urban fantasy and gore and action. That is, I think, the best way somebody really summed my book up. It was like, those two quotes from readers who, they gave a beautiful review. And one of them was, this story is like an extreme horror version of Supernatural. I loved it so much that now every time I pitch the book to somebody, I'm like, this is how I'm pitching it. Because, 11 seasons, and, so a lot of people know what the show Supernatural is. And when somebody says, I've never watched Supernatural, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm like, are you from America? You're from the U.S., right? But then I also have to recognize that it's a generational thing too nowadays. My favorite, and it was my first review, and she just put it so lovely. She said, this novel is like being thrown into an extreme haunted house, and then somebody slammed the door and locked it behind you. And I'm like, that is beautiful. And then she also compared my work to Clive Barker's, which just like made my day.
Yeah, those are both perfect. I mean, the Supernatural is like the perfect elevator pitch for the story, and then that's a beautiful description to kind of explain it.
Yeah. Especially, so a lot of my readers, a lot of like, I would say like, a lot of the people who really campaigned, because you get these readers who are like very passionate about your book, and it's like, I'm so thankful for them,
Mm-hmm.
But one of my readers, Heather Christine, she's on here on TikTok, and she's a lovely human being. She campaigns so hard for indie authors.
Yes.
So she is, and like a lot of my reaction videos are of her, because she just does an amazing job of actually like describing what she went through reading your story, right? But I mean, she doesn't normally read horror. In fact, my horror novel was one of the first horror novels she's ever read, and she just like took a chance on me. And and I think that's like, for me, the biggest payoff, the biggest payday for me is taking somebody who's never read a horror novel and giving them this book, and they read it and they love it. Mm-hmm. And they were like, I can't wait to read more horror now. And all they've ever read was like fantasy or romantasy or something. And you're like, well, I'm glad you took it, or dark romance. I'm like, oh, well, I'm glad you took a break from the whips and chains and decided to read some tentacles and teeth. But yeah, it's like, it's interesting. Like, most of my readers are people who've never read horror, and that's kind of a big proud moment for me, I think. Mm-hmm. That I've introduced a whole genre to a new group of readers out there. And they love it, So
it's the support of the book talk community, and Heather, again, like you said, is one of the main ones.
Amazing.
But the support of the community alone, when you do get the readers that get behind your work and love talking about it, love supporting it and doing things, it really is a beautiful thing. And your point to get readers that haven't read horror and get them into horror, again, that's the one thing you would absolutely want to happen as a writer, right? Because you made a good point earlier when you were talking about the mental health and some of the movies all being stereotypes. It's always because it's written by people that don't know or don't even bother trying to learn, and they're just like, okay, this is what I think, and they write it in that fashion, right? So a lot of times, a lot of horror or people that haven't read horror, there's a lot of stuff on here about the extreme horror. They may be afraid of those, right? And
Yeah.
they don't understand that sometimes horror is maybe more on the thriller side. It's more on the emotional side of horror, not necessarily. Yeah, there's gore and some of that stuff and that, but it might not be heavy on that side. And it's just amazing when you can get somebody to transition and understand what a beautiful genre it can be, when you start reading that and understanding just the stuff that's the core of what horror is.
Well, and every horror novel has beating heart. Like you said, there's something at the core of the story. Um, whether it's talking about, you know, like for instance, right now I'm reading Maeve Fly, and and it's a beautiful story, written very, very well. I love it. Um, and one of the things that she talks about in that story, the narrator is talking about is like how, women are not like allowed to be villains. It has to, like, something has to happen to a woman to make her become a villain, and she has to have this horrible experience, or something has to be taken. Why not just be born a villain? I'm like, I mean, because like you read about male villains, the male main character villain, or whatever, the antagonist, and it's like they just are. They are what they are. It's like that's their nature, and the main character, says that a lot, and I'm like, I get it. Yeah, I can see how I would actually respect, and I think it's like there needs to be more characters like that, especially written by women. And that's something I also got to experience as a new book talk community member, is to hear more voices from people who aren't, being heard. One of which are female horror writers,
Yep.
writing from their perspective. But so you get to kind of get immersed into some of these stories that are told from the feminine perspective, and I love that, because I can't write, like, I try to write female characters. I try to write strong female characters. I don't like writing the stereotypical, woman running through the woods in her underwear, victim. I don't like that. I try to write characters who have guts, and whether they get spilled or not, that's it depends on the story.
That just confirms that they were there, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, but they're real. But the thing is, like, two of my main characters in the story, I feel I wrote them because I want them to be strong. I want them to be beautiful and strong and witty and all this other stuff. And I hope I did the readers justice, my female readers justice. When they read these characters and they read about them, I hope that they, they see that and they're like, oh, that's that's a very cool character. I also try to write characters who don't get written about enough. For instance, one of my main characters is Hindu, or Hindi. She's Hindi. She is also deaf and mute, so I got to write from somebody who's, like, physical experience is nothing but the physical, like, our sight and touch. Those are her main sensory, like, she has to depend on all of them, but she's, it's like, what happens to a person who's deaf, but then you, like, shut off the lights? I mean, that's huge. And being introduced to one of the cool things about where I'm at right now in Olathe, Kansas, is that we have a huge school for the deaf here, huge school. And one of the cool things about that is I get to hear stories, pun intended, not intended, pun not intended, about how that kind of communication and that sensory experience and stuff like that. I'm also writing about a Native American character, an indigenous character. I shouldn't say Native American because that's not accurate, but an indigenous person. And I'm trying to honor that culture as well. And then like currently in my next book, I'm writing about a couple of characters who are either transgender or gender fluid. And I had to I don't get just write, I'm just going to write about this character, see what happens. No, I mean, I have, if you want to give respect to these cultures and these people and these subcultures, you have to go and do your research. Otherwise, you're just being an asshole. But
very true.
I don't know how much more time do you need, Adrian?
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay, great. Yeah, because unfortunately, I as much as I love talking here, I do have to go. And I love everybody who showed up here tonight and just got to let me ramble. I really hope that you guys go out and try check out my book, Become Bearing Curses. Good news is next month it's going to be an audiobook, hopefully here in the next couple of months.
Nice.
Yeah, it's getting produced right now, and I have a couple of signing events coming up too. So I'll be posting that on my webpage, which I had a wonderful person build that for me. And if you go to thecovergirlsbookclub.com, and I'm sure you've heard about them, they are amazing. And Emily on there just did an amazing job putting that together for me. So much respect for that woman. So Zachariah Chamberlain, just my pay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, ZachariahChamberlain.com, my first and last name, all one word. I'm always posting events, some news, stuff like that. So I'm so glad that I got to talk with you again, Adrian.
Yeah, me too. I really wanted to do this again. Again, for those that haven't seen the whole thing or weren't able to join, I'm going to download this onto my YouTube podcast. I'll send out the link. I'll take Zach so you can share it for everybody
Thanks.
that wasn't able to see this. And definitely remember, just tag me on your post so I can share that stuff on YouTube as well and get it out there. I'm
Heck yeah.
happy to do that.
Yeah, and I'm still learning so much about TikTok. So if you see something, I'm like, hey man, you could get more readers if you try this. Clue me in because I'm all thumbs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you everybody for watching. And like I said, I will download this, repost it with a link, and thank you again, Zach, for coming on. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. And all you here, check out my book. Love you all. It's been a lot of fun.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.